The day I became the most hated man in Lakeside Grove was the same day I became its most powerful. 1-0. That's what the HOA fined me for fishing with my grieving son. What they didn't know was that I had 4 million reasons to fight back, and enough spite to use every single one of them. They are wrong when they saw an old black man in worn boots and assumed I had no fight in me. Welcome to my channel. If you love insane HOA revenge stories, hit that subscribe button because this one is wild. She came striding across the grass like she owned the land itself. Mid-50s, clad in crisp white athletic wear that had never seen sweat, her hair frozen in place by spray and years of practiced authority. She didn't look at me, she looked through me. "I'm going to need you to stop what you're doing immediately," she said, tapping on a sleek tablet like she was issuing a citation in some suburban courtroom. "This is private property. You're in violation." I rose from the dock slowly. My son, Malik, still sat with his hands gripping the fishing rod, eyes wide. He didn't move. "I'm just fishing with my son," I said calmly. "We live on Sycamore Drive, been here about 6 weeks. "Doesn't matter," she snapped. "Fishing is prohibited on the community lake. The rules were updated, and unless you've been living under a rock, you should have known that." I could feel the way her eyes scanned me, not just the rod, not just the tackle box, but the scuffed boots, the old denim, the skin. "The fine is 1-0. And before you protest, yes, it applies even to new residents. This isn't a public park, sir." Malik's line went slack. He slowly reeled it in without a word. I kept my voice level. "When we bought the house, the listing mentioned the lake as a resident amenity." She raised her eyebrows, smile tight. "Well, amenities come with standards. And not all activities reflect the image Lakeside Grove wants to maintain. There have been complaints." "Complaints?" I asked. "Hooks are a danger to wildlife, bait smells, and frankly, not everyone enjoys this kind of visual while sipping coffee from their patio." There it was again. The kind of this she didn't want to see. Malik looked down, quiet. His joy drained faster than the line in his reel. I nodded. "We'll leave. Please send the fine and the updated guidelines to my email." Her satisfaction was barely hidden. "Wonderful. Let's hope this is your last misunderstanding." She turned, heels clicking softly against the manicured path. I packed up in silence, but my hands didn't tremble. Let her think it ended here. Let her believe that the man in worn boots would go quietly. They always downtell the day they don't. The fine was only the beginning. 3 days later, a notice appeared taped to my front door. "Lawn exceeds approved length, 150 penalty." The grass was barely an inch taller than the neighbors. Still, I trimmed it before sunset. 2 days after that, a second violation. Trash bins not returned to side yard within HOA timeframe. They'd been out for 20 minutes. Malik had brought them in after school, right after finishing his homework. Then came the warning about my mailbox aesthetic deviation. I hadn't touched it. I'd lived long enough to recognize a pattern when I saw one. The violations weren't about rules, they were about pressure, isolation, making sure I felt watched, unwelcome, out of place. Neighbors who had once waved politely now avoided eye contact. A jogger crossed to the opposite side of the street when passing our driveway. A man I'd never spoken to left a note in my mailbox. "Not the right fit here. Maybe you should consider relocating." I didn't show Malik the note, but I caught him one morning, sitting on the porch in silence, his fishing rod untouched. The same kid who once begged me for just 5 more minutes at every lake. I'd moved us here hoping for healing, but Lakeside Grove had turned that hope into something smaller, something tight in the chest. Still, I said nothing, not yet. But I started paying attention. I noticed how the HOA's citations seemed to favor the east side of the neighborhood where most of the new, non-white residents had moved in. I noticed how Sandra Wellington's friends, with their decorative bird feeders and wildflower patches, never got cited for the same things. And I noticed Helen Morris. She lived 2 houses down, white, mid-60s, a widow. For weeks, she'd offered me a quiet nod, nothing more. But the day I got my 3rd violation, She left banana bread on my porch with a yellow post-it. They tried this with the Nguyen's last year, you're not crazy. I didn't know if she meant to take a side, but for the first time in days, I didn't feel completely alone. And that, I knew, was how real resistance always started. I'd lived through enough boardrooms and backhanded contracts to know one thing. People rarely use rules to protect others, they use them to protect control. So I started digging. I didn't tell Malik. He needed space to be a kid, not a witness. But after he asked me one night if fishing was only allowed for white kids, I knew I couldn't just take the fine and move on. I wasn't just raising a son, I was raising a man. And men need to see what quiet dignity looks like when it's pushed too far. I pulled out the HOA manual, the one they'd mailed with our welcome packet, heavy with regulations and light on transparency. I flipped to the section on lake use, recreational restrictions. It was vague intentionally so. No ownership document, no cited land deed. Just a declaration that use of the lake is governed by the Lakeside Grove HOA in accordance with environmental and aesthetic standards. That kind of language is written to sound legal but mean absolutely nothing. So I called the county recorder's office. It took a couple of hours and some old connections from my finance days, but I got what I needed. The lake, officially labeled Parcel 17B, was not owned by the HOA. It was still under the name of a development company, Cedarline Properties, LLC, the same company that had built the neighborhood 2 decades ago. And better yet, the parcel was marked, pending release for sale, private negotiation. In plain English, they were quietly looking for a buyer. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. The HOA didn't own the lake. They rented the rights to manage it under a 30-year lease, and that lease was set to expire in 5 months. All the rules Sandra had been barking about, all the fines, the bans, the posturing, they had no claim over that water, no true authority. They were operating on a leash, and the leash was slipping. I reached for my phone and made a call I hadn't made in years. "Sam," I said when the voice picked up, "you still at Talridge Investments?" There was a pause, then a familiar chuckle. "Elijah Barnes. I figured retirement would have killed your appetite for war by now. Turns out I've still got a little fight in me." Sam Green had been my closest partner during the early days of venture capital work. While I pulled out of the game after Rachel's passing, Sam stayed in and rose higher, now managing director at a boutique acquisitions firm. I told him everything, not the HOA drama, not yet, just the facts: a lake, mislabeled ownership, an HOA bluffing with no deed in hand, and a seller possibly desperate for liquidity. "Off-market deal?" he asked. "Private negotiation," I said. "I want first seat at the table." Sam whistled. "You planning to flip it?" "No," I said, standing and looking out the window at the lake, still, wide, quiet. "I'm planning to end a power trip." There was a pause. "Send me the parcel file and your proof of HOA bluffing. If it's as clean as you say, I'll put in a call." I hung up, heart steady but alive in a way I hadn't felt in months. This wasn't revenge, not really. It was about something bigger, about drawing a line, not just for me and Malik, but for anyone who'd been told with a smile that they didn't belong. 2 days later, Sam sent me an encrypted email. "Seller receptive, negotiation window, 10 days, act fast." And so, I did. I filed for a private LLC, secured funds from a dormant account, and prepared an offer under a generic corporate name. I knew if the HOA caught wind, they'd move fast and dirty. But they wouldn't see me coming, they never do. On the morning of the 10th day, I signed the initial purchase agreement for Parcel 17B. I hadn't told a soul in the neighborhood. Not even Helen, who had started waving from her porch instead of just nodding. I wanted this clean, undisturbed. Silent power makes the deepest shift. That night, Malik and I sat on the porch. He didn't bring up the lake. Just leaned on my shoulder and watched the stars blink alive. "Can we go fishing again sometime?" he asked, barely above a whisper. I smiled, just enough for him to feel it. "Soon," I said. And this time, no one was going to stop us. I didn't say a word. Not to Malik, not to Helen, not to the neighbors who now pretended I wasn't there. Silence, in a place like Lakeside Grove, was mistaken for weakness. I let them think that. Behind closed doors, I moved fast. With Sam's help, I created a limited liability company B.H. Partners registered out of state, untraceable to me. We used it to submit a formal offer to Cedarline Properties for parcel 17B, the lake. The same one Sandra had been treating like her private moat. Cedarline replied within 48 hours. They were open to selling. Turns out, the lake had become a financial dead weight, aging infrastructure, liability risks, and no real revenue. They didn't care who bought it, as long as the check cleared. Perfect. While negotiations advanced, the HOA continued their campaign. A new violation notice, unapproved mailbox color. It hadn't changed since we moved in. I printed it, filed it away, and added it to my growing dossier. Selective enforcement, OA pattern of targeting. I saw Sandra from across the lake a few times, her sunglasses glinting in the sun as she led tours of potential buyers along the walking path. She spoke with that same tone, polished, cold, and smug. I wondered if she had any clue the land beneath her feet was already slipping away. She didn't. By the end of the week, I signed the contract. The lake was officially mine under B.H.'s name. I told no one. I just sat on the porch that night with Malik. He didn't ask about the lake, he just leaned into my side, quiet as ever. I wrapped my arm around his shoulder and said, "We're going fishing again, soon." He looked up, surprised. "Really?" "Really," I nodded. "And this time, nobody's going to fine us for it." Inside, on the kitchen counter, was a bright flyer from the HOA, a meeting invitation. Big announcement on the future of Lakeside Grove's lake area. I pinned it to the fridge. Then I smiled, not out of spite, but because the truth was coming. And this time, they'd hear it on my terms. The HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a beige, overly air-conditioned room that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and tension. Folded chairs were arranged in neat rows, and at the front, a whiteboard displayed. Future of the lake, a shared vision. In large, bubbly letters. I arrived early, took a seat in the back, and said nothing. Malik stayed home. I didn't want him seeing what was about to happen, not because I feared conflict, but because I knew the ugliness in that room wasn't his burden to carry. The seats filled slowly, mostly the usual face homeowners in pressed polos, cardigans draped over shoulders, name tags that somehow looked more like badges than introductions. Helen sat quietly 2 rows ahead, her eyes meeting mine for half a second, just enough to say, "I know." At 6:03, Sandra Wellington swept in like she owned the oxygen. She wore a tailored blazer, pearls, and a smile that tried too hard. In her hands was a leather folder she tapped gently against the podium, signaling the start of her performance. "Good evening, everyone," she said, voice rich with polished authority. "Tonight, I'm thrilled to share an exciting new chapter for Lakeside Grover, planned to transform the lake area into a more refined, exclusive amenity for residents." There were nods, polite applause. Someone murmured, "About time." Sandra clicked a remote. The projector displayed mock-ups of pavilions, paddleboat docks, and fencing that clearly blocked access from several homes, including mine. "With these changes," she continued, "we can ensure a cleaner, safer, and more aesthetically consistent shoreline experience." That was code: clean, safe, consistent. Words that pretended to care while excluding the people they were meant to remove. Then she said it. "We're currently finalizing a private purchase agreement with Cedarline Properties to acquire the lake outright under the HOA's ownership." I stood up. Calm, deliberate. "Actually," I said, my voice steady but loud enough to cut through the hum, "that agreement won't be necessary." Heads turned. Sandra blinked. "Excuse me?" she said, laughing lightly. "I purchased the lake 2 weeks ago." The room went still. You could hear a cough in the corner, a chair creak, nothing else. Sandra's expression faltered, like a porcelain vase knocked just off balance. "That's impossible, Cedarline accepted my offer through B.H. Partners. It's been finalized. I have the deed here. I stepped forward and laid the folder on the podium. The legal papers slid out like a quiet avalanche. I now own parcel 17B. The lake is private property, I continued, which means the HOA no longer has authority over it, nor the right to impose fines for using it. Sandra didn't speak. She stared at the documents, lips parted, searching for a foothold. But this was supposed to be a community enhancement project, she said. No, I said. It was a gate. You were building a gate to keep people like me out. Gasps, murmurs. One man in a pastel polo stood up and asked, "Is this real?" "It's very real," Helen said, rising now, her voice calm. "And it's time we start asking who this HOA has really been serving." Sandra looked around, but the room no longer belonged to her. I turned to leave. Before I stepped out the door, I paused. Starting next week, the lake will be open, not gated, not fenced, open to families, to kids, to those who've been told they don't belong. I looked at Sandra one last time. "You should read the fine print next time." And then I walked away. No raised voice, no threats, just the weight of truth and the silence that follows when a lie finally collapses. For someone who had ruled Lakeside Grove with absolute confidence, Sandra Wellington unraveled quickly. Within days of the HOA meeting, word spread faster than I expected. The smug smiles on morning walks turned into cautious nods. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now hesitated, unsure whether to apologize or pretend they had never clapped when I was fined. It started with a petition. A small group of residents, led by Helen Morris, demanded a full audit of the HOA's financial activities. They wanted to know where dues had gone, who had approved Sandra's lakefront development expenses, and why so many violations seemed targeted at families of color or newcomers. The signatures piled up fast. Then came the anonymous leaks. Screenshots of HOA emails circulated quietly, phrases like filtering long-term residents from transitional buyers and protecting the Grove's character were hard to explain away. So was the fact that Sandra's husband's construction firm had been pre-approved for the lake enhancement contract, months before the HOA vote. At first, Sandra tried to hold her ground. She called a special meeting, brought muffins, smiled more than usual, claimed it was all a misunderstanding and that her intentions were purely in service of neighborhood integrity. But nobody clapped this time. Then she made her final mistake. She tried to challenge the lake sale. Filed a motion with the HOA board claiming I had acted in bad faith and that the property should have been made available to the association first. But the deed was airtight. H partners had followed every procedure. The sale was legal, binding, and irrevocable. Sam's legal team responded with a letter that ended, simply, "Any attempt to trespass, impede, or exert false authority over parcel 17B will result in immediate legal action." Sandra withdrew the complaint the next day. 2 weeks later, she quietly stepped down as president of the HOA, citing personal health concerns, no farewell party, no flowers. Just a printed memo in mailboxes with her name typed at the bottom, already beginning to fade. One morning, Malik and I walked to the lake. No fences, no signs, just water and sunlight. 2 kids from the other side of the neighborhood were casting lines from the dock. One of them waved. Malik hesitated, then waved back. We sat under a tree, and for the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like air, clean and free. Helen joined us later that afternoon. She didn't say much, just brought lemonade and a book. We watched as more families arrived. A Latino father teaching his daughters how to bait a hook. An elderly Vietnamese couple walking hand in hand by the shore. A young white couple tossing breadcrumbs to ducks. No one told anyone they didn't belong. And in that moment, it became clear, this had never been about a lake. It had been about ownership, not of land, but of space, of dignity, of presence. That's what they tried to take from us. That's what we took back. Helen leaned over and said quietly, she never saw it coming. I smiled. They rarely do. Not when you don't raise your voice. Not when you wait and let the truth speak louder than anything else. Spring arrived early that year. The trees around Lakeside Grove began to bloom, timid at first, like they were testing whether this new season would last. And for the first time since we moved in, I started to believe maybe, just maybe, peace could belong here too. The lake had changed, not in the way Sandra Wellington had planned, but in a way no one expected. Gone were the fences, the warning signs, and the watchful eyes behind tinted sunglasses. In their place were families, kids on bicycles, grandmothers with lawn chairs and wide-brimmed hats, teenagers skipping stones. The shoreline had come alive not because someone gave permission, but because someone finally stopped pretending to own what belonged to everyone. I didn't put up a monument or a plaque, no speech, no ribbon cutting. But I did change the name. Amani Lake. After my son. The one who had lost his mother and, for a while, lost his laughter too. The boy who sat beside me the day we were fined, who reeled in his line with shaking hands and eyes too old for his age. Now, he stood at the edge of the dock, showing two younger kids how to tie a hook, his voice easy, his face sunlit. That was enough monument for me. Helen helped me form a small advisory group, not a committee, not a board, just a few neighbors who cared about keeping the lake clean, safe, and free, no politics, no agendas. Just responsibility shared, not wielded. One Saturday, a woman approached me as I was collecting stray cans from the grass. She looked hesitant, the kind of hesitation that carried shame beneath it. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I believe them. The letters, the rules. I thought you didn't fit." I didn't say anything right away. She went on. "But then I saw what you did, and now my son comes here every afternoon. Says it's the only place he feels like himself." I nodded. "Then it's working." She smiled small, grateful, and walked away. Sometimes redemption doesn't come with confession. It comes with change. That night, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, Malik asleep upstairs, the world quiet around me. I thought of Rachel, of what she would have said if she were here. I think she would have laughed. Then looked me straight in the eye and said, "Took you long enough." She was always the brave one. I just followed through. I didn't set out to fight the HOA. I didn't plan on becoming the most hated man in Lakeside Grove. But when they fined me, 1-0 for fishing with my grieving son, something in me refused to bend. They thought they saw everything when they looked at me. A tired old black man in worn boots, someone to push around, someone who'd leave quietly. But they didn't see what I carried. They didn't see the fire beneath the silence. They didn't see what dignity looks like when it holds a fishing rod and a deed. Now, when people ask how I ended up owning a lake, I tell them the truth. I wasn't trying to buy water. I was trying to buy space for peace, for family, for anyone who needed it. And I paid for it in full, not just with money, but with patience, memory, and the simple belief that sometimes the quiet man wins.